Bill Maher's grin stretched across the stage, his words dressed as a joke, but soaked in something sharper, something darker. The audience chuckled, some nervously, some eagerly, the sound bouncing through the studio like a signal that it was safe to laugh, safe to join in. But in that laughter lingered a discomfort, uneasy, brittle. And then across the table, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. The freeze frame hung heavy in the air. Maher's smirk. The ripple of awkward giggles in Jasmine's eyes, locked unblinking. Cutting through the noise like glass. The laughter died. The narrator's voice would echo in memory when Jasmine leaned forward. It was a subtle gesture, but it shifted the room. The audience, who thought they'd just signed up for late-night comedy, suddenly realized they were sitting front row to something else entirely. Not banter, not playfulness. This wasn't a gag setup for applause. This was the opening of a confrontation. An unscripted clash that no one had prepared for, least of all Maher himself. Every sound in the room seemed to collapse into silence. Cups stopped clinking. A few uneasy coughs punctured the air. And there sat Jasmine, shoulders squared, her voice unspoken but already demanding. Did you really think that would slide? Viewers at home froze just as much as the live audience. Clips were already being clipped, tweets drafted mid-broadcast. They didn't know exactly what was coming, but they knew one thing. This wasn't going to end the way Maher thought it would, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a guest in his world of smirks and sound bites. She was a truth-teller, a disruptor, someone who had spent her career refusing to play along with the unspoken rules that power tries to enforce. She wasn't about to let a remark steeped in casual prejudice pass as comedy. Not tonight. Not in 20 to 5. And so, with one lean forward, she rewrote the script. The room braced itself. Maher's smirk flickered, and the nation leaned closer to their screens, waiting for the strike they knew was coming. What came next turned late-night comedy into a national reckoning. Bill Maher wasn't just another television host tossing out one-liners to fill the gaps between ad breaks. For decades, he had carved out his place as one of America's most recognizable comedians, someone who blended humor with sharp commentary, wielding sarcasm like a sword, and often setting the tone for what counted as edgy or acceptable in mainstream conversation. Millions tuned in, not just to laugh, but to absorb the subtle boundaries he drew. What could be joked about? What could be dismissed? What could be reduced to a punchline? Power masked behind the language of comedy was no small thing. It shaped the narrative. It granted permission. And when it was used carelessly, it stung deeper than most headlines. That's why the moment with Jasmine Crockett carried so much weight. Because she wasn't a background guest there to nod along or laugh politely. She had come to represent something bigger, a rising voice of truth, dignity, and resistance in an era where those values were constantly under attack. She wasn't just a congresswoman or a progressive firebrand. She was a vessel for millions who had grown tired of watching prejudice slip through the cracks, disguised as just jokes. This was 2025, and America still wrestling with its own identity. Cancel culture wasn't just a buzzword. It was the battlefield where careers were tested and reputations were remade. And Bill Maher, with his smirk and his platform, stood as a symbol of the establishment media, untouchable, dismissive, certain that his wit could shield him from accountability. But Jasmine Crockett represented the opposite. Her power wasn't. In punchlines, it was in precision. Her voice wasn't laced with sarcasm. It was built on truth. For her, dignity wasn't optional. It was the weapon, the armor, the line in the sand. And in that tense studio, she carried it with the kind of quiet intensity that made every person watching feel that the stakes had just skyrocketed, because this wasn't only about Bill Maher. It was about a long history of moments where identity, race, and dignity were tossed into the realm of comedy and dismissed as oversensitivity when challenged. It was about who got to define the limits of free speech and whose voices were always forced to bear the brunt of jokes that weren't harmless at all. The nervous laughter of the audience had revealed everything. How quick people were to normalize prejudice when it came wrapped in humor, and how rare it was to see someone stand up and say, "Enough." In that silence after Maher's remark, in that subtle lean forward from Jasmine, the ground shifted. The crowd wasn't just waiting for a rebuttal. They were waiting to see if someone would finally puncture the illusion that comedy can excuse cruelty. And Jasmine was ready. She wasn't just about to defend herself. She wasn't just about to check a comedian on his own stage. What she was about to say was bigger than the moment, bigger than Maher, bigger even than the room they sat in. It was for the millions watching at home who had carried that same sting. It's the ones who had heard laughter at their expense and had no microphone to respond. And when Jasmine chose to answer, it wasn't just for herself. It was for everyone watching. For years, Bill Maher has thrived in the role of provocateur. He wears it like a badge, branding himself as the comedian who tells it like it is, the man unafraid to push buttons, offend sensibilities, and laugh at the outrage that follows. To his fans, this makes him fearless. To his critics, it makes him arrogant. Arrogance, once it calcifies, turns into something even more dangerous. A blindness to the very people whose dignity he so casually diminishes. Maher's persona has long been built on contradiction. On one hand, he champions himself as a crusader for free speech, the defender of comedy against what he sees as suffocating political correctness. He rails against cancel culture with the zeal of a man convinced he's protecting the soul of American expression. Yet, in the very same breath, he uses that freedom to mock and belittle voices from marginalized communities, the very people for whom speech is not simply entertainment, but survival. He insists that comedy should be untouchable, immune to criticism, immune to accountability. But in doing so, he cloaks cruelty in punchlines and then shrugs when the sting lingers long after the laughter fades. This isn't new. Maher has built a career on walking that fine line between wit and contempt, forever skirting the edge of offensiveness and then retreating into the safety of relax. It's just a joke. That line, just a joke, has become his shield, his fallback, his escape hatch. But shields don't erase wounds. And for many watching at home, his jokes have never been harmless. They've been reminders that their identities, their struggles, their very humanity can still be reduced to cheap laughs in front of millions. And yet, Maher thrives on that provocation, courts it. Each backlash becomes proof in his mind that he's doing something right, that he's the lone truth-teller in a world of oversensitive critics. Every eye roll, every social media storm, he greets with smug satisfaction, convinced it only adds to his legend. It's an addiction, Anne. Addiction to the controversy, to the headlines, to being the man who goes further than anyone else will dare. But like all addictions, it comes with blind spots. And one of those blind spots was underestimating Jasmine Crockett to Maher. Crockett was just another guest, another politician who could be jabbed at, teased, maybe even embarrassed for the sake of a laugh. He saw her as part of the machine he has spent his career mocking, another easy target. What he didn't see was her steel, her discipline, her ability to turn words into weapons far sharper than sarcasm. What he didn't see was that this wasn't a politician eager for airtime. This was a truth-teller whose very presence challenged the rules of his stage. Maher's downfall, in that moment, was rooted in his overconfidence. He believed his years of experience, his reputation, his captive audience, gave him the upper hand. He leaned on the assumption that laughter, even nervous, laughter was power, that if he could get the crowd to chuckle, he had won. But power built on dismissiveness is fragile. It can crumble in an instant when confronted with dignity that refuses to bow. The hypocrisy at the core of Maher's act was about to be exposed, not by activists outside the studio, not by critics writing reviews, but by someone sitting directly across from him, someone who didn't flinch, who didn't laugh, who didn't give him the validation of letting it slide. Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to play along. She wasn't there to excuse prejudice under the guise of comedy. And in the stillness after his remark, when the room seemed to balance between laughter and discomfort, she shifted the dynamic entirely. Maher thought he was in control. He thought his words were untouchable, immune to real challenge. has a way of cracking under pressure, and provocation always carries the risk of pushing too far. When Jasmine leaned forward, ready to speak, the smug certainty on Maher's face masked the unraveling about to begin, because in that instant, the roles inverted. The so-called master of the room was about to lose command of it. Who thrived on exposing others was about to be exposed himself. And the comedian who prided himself on silencing opponents with laughter was about to learn what silence really feels like. Before Jasmine Crockett ever sat across from Bill Maher, before her words commanded a room and rippled across millions of screens, she was a fighter forged in fire. Her story wasn't one of privilege or easy ascents. It was one of grit, resilience, a refusal to let silence bury the truth of who she was and who she represented. Born into a world that rarely made space for voices like hers, Jasmine grew up knowing the weight of being underestimated. She knew what it meant to watch others speak for communities they didn't belong to hear people in power dismiss pain as exaggeration, to see dignity bartered away in exchange for punchlines. She carried those lessons with her not as burdens, but as fuel, each slight, each dismissal. Each door that was shut in her face became another spark pushing her forward. Her rise wasn't accidental. It was intentional. While others built careers on polished spin and rehearsed sound bites, Jasmine built hers on unfiltered authenticity. When she spoke, it wasn't from talking points crafted in a backroom. It was from lived experience. People felt it. They felt the fire of someone who wasn't pretending to understand struggle. She had lived it, breathed it, endured it. Every word carried the gravity of someone who knew what it meant to be unheard, unseen, and disrespected. Jasmine's authenticity became her weapon. In a political landscape where truth is often smothered by noise, she cut through with clarity. She wasn't interested in playing the part of the agreeable guest on panels or the token voice in conversations about identity. She wasn't interested in letting her presence be used as a shield against criticism. She was there to speak to, remind people that dignity is not negotiable, that silence in the face of prejudice is complicity. But what set Jasmine apart wasn't just her ability to clap back. It was the way she carried history with her. She leaned into a microphone. She wasn't speaking for herself alone. She was carrying the echoes of generations who had been mocked, sidelined, or silenced, who had been laughed at rather than listened to, who had been dismissed as too sensitive or too angry when they dared to demand respect. For Jasmine, every debate, every insult, every moment like this was not about ego. It was about responsibility. Her resilience was sharpened by years of navigating rooms where she was the only one willing to call out the hypocrisy. She had been underestimated countless times, dismissed as too young, too direct, too unapologetic. And yet, time and again, she turned those underestimations into victories. She learned that dignity wasn't about playing by someone else's rules. It was about rewriting the rules altogether. That night on Maher's stage, Jasmine didn't just bring herself. She brought the voices of countless others who never got the microphone. She brought the frustrations of those tired of seeing comedy weaponized against their identity. She brought the strength of a community that had been told, again and again, to laugh off disrespect in order to be accepted. And she brought the courage to say what so many had been waiting to hear. Her voice was calm, but it carried storms. It was the kind of calm born not from passivity, but from discipline, the kind that comes when you know you've faced worse, endured worse, and you are still here, standing. That composure wasn't weakness, it was power. It was the quiet strength that makes arrogance tremble because arrogance feeds on chaos. And Jasmine refused to give it the satisfaction. In her, people saw more than a politician or a guest on a late-night show. They saw a mirror reflecting their own struggles back at them, dignified and unapologetic. They saw a reminder that authenticity, even when inconvenient, can be the most disruptive force in any room. They saw a woman who wasn't there to win applause, but to speak truth in. Sometimes truth is the loudest sound of all. Even when it's spoken softly, this wasn't just about clapping back. This was about rewriting the script of who gets to laugh, who gets to speak, and who gets to define the boundaries of respect. This was about refusing to let mockery go unchallenged, refusing to let prejudice be disguised as humor, refusing to let silence betray those who had endured it for far too long. Jasmine Crockett carried history into that room. Every moment of her journey had prepared her for this clash, not just the battles she fought in public, but the invisible ones she fought in private. Every scar, every dismissal, every moment of doubt had shaped her into the woman who now sat across from Maher. She was not intimidated, not rattled, not desperate for approval. She was ready, and as the crowd shifted uneasily in their seats, as the nervous laughter died and silence filled the space, Jasmine leaned forward. Her eyes held the kind of certainty that comes from knowing history wasn't just watching it. Was about to answer back, Maher leaned back in his chair, smirk curling at the edges of his mouth as if daring Jasmine to challenge him. He doubled down, lacing his words with sarcasm that disguised itself as wit, but carried a sting of condescension.
Ow.
To him, it was just another night behind the desk, another chance to push the boundary, needle the guest, and win a laugh at someone else's expense. He thrived on the smugness, the sense that his stage was his kingdom, and anyone sitting across from him had entered on his terms. The audience followed his cues, but uneasily. Some laughed laughter, edged with nervousness, unsure if they were laughing with him or at the tension sparking between him and Jasmine. Others shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, wondering if they were witnessing a joke that had gone too far. The air grew heavier with each punchline, each jab cloaked as humor. The room itself seemed to pulse with divided energy, one half entertained, the other half unsettled. Maher pressed harder, sensing the discomfort but mistaking it for control. He thought he was cornering Jasmine, painting her as overly sensitive, the politician who can't take a joke. He mocked her seriousness, rolled his eyes, raised his voice for effect. The studio lights glared, amplifying the sweat on his forehead that he didn't notice, the strain in his laughter that came just a beat too late. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat steady, her silence deliberate, her eyes locked on him not with anger, but with an unshakable calm. She knew something. Maher didn't. Silence has power. While he filled the room with noise, she let the pause grow heavier, thicker, more undeniable. Every second she refused to react chipped away at his authority, shifting the crowd's focus from his words to her composure and beyond the walls of the studio. The buzz had already begun. Online, clips of the exchange were being posted in real time. Twitter timelines lit up with commentary. Maher pushing too far? Crockett looks ready to end him. TikTok feeds filled with edits, slowed down frames of Jasmine's face as she leaned forward, waiting, calculating. Reddit threads popped up dissecting every smirk, every pause, every sigh. The internet was holding its collective breath, refreshing. Again and again, waiting for the inevitable moment they knew was coming. Inside the studio, the tension was electric. Maher chuckled, but the sound landed flat. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he was performing for himself, not for the room. He mistook Jasmine's silence for weakness, for hesitation. He didn't see the strategy, didn't recognize the calculation. He thought he had won before she'd even spoken. The audience leaned forward. Phones were lifted. Cameras zoomed. The energy shifted subtly, no longer riding the rhythm of Maher's words, but pulled toward Jasmine's silence. People sensed it, that the storm wasn't in his sarcasm, but in her restraint. Every heartbeat, every breath stretched the suspense tighter. Maher's arrogance only deepened. He shrugged, cracked another half-smile, gestured with his hands, as if to say, "See? Nothing to add?" His voice rose, louder than it needed to be, betraying a flicker of insecurity he couldn't mask. He was trying to hold the room, but the room was already slipping from his grasp, and Jasmine waited, silent, composed, calculating. The cameras caught the slight tilt of her head, the narrowing of her eyes, the poised stillness of someone who wasn't cornered, but preparing to strike. She didn't need to interrupt. She didn't need to match his volume or his smugness. She knew the power of timing, and her timing was impeccable. The crowd could feel it coming, though they didn't know when. The internet could feel it too, every refresh, every clip, every whisper, building anticipation. It wasn't just about a comeback anymore. It was about a reckoning, the moment when dignity would meet arrogance head-on. Maher leaned back once more, confident he had the upper hand. The laughter he had wrung from the crowd was thinner now, more fragile. He grinned anyway, oblivious to the shift, blind to the silence growing louder than his words. And then Jasmine moved. She leaned forward, the studio lights catching the determination. In her eyes, the laughter stopped. The audience froze. Online feeds began to explode then, with one devastating reply, shattered the room. Bill Maher leaned back in his chair, smirk curling at the edges of his mouth as if daring Jasmine to challenge him. He doubled down, lacing his words with sarcasm that disguised itself as wit but carried a sting of condescension. To him it was just another night behind the desk, another chance to push the boundary, needle the guest, and win a laugh at someone else's expense. He thrived on the smugness. The sense that his stage was his kingdom and anyone sitting across from him had entered on his terms. The audience followed his cues, but uneasily. Some laughed laughter edged with nervousness, unsure if they were laughing with him or at the tension sparking between him and Jasmine. Others shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, wondering if they were witnessing a joke that had gone too far. The air grew heavier with each punchline, each jab cloaked as humor. The room itself seemed to pulse with divided energy. One half entertained the other. Half unsettled, Maher pressed harder, sensing the discomfort but mistaking it for control. He thought he was cornering Jasmine, painting her as overly sensitive, the politician who can't take a joke. He mocked her seriousness, rolled his eyes, raised his voice for effect. The studio lights glared, amplifying the sweat on his forehead that he didn't notice, the strain in his laughter that came just a beat too late. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat steady, her silence deliberate, her eyes locked on him not with anger but with an unshakable calm. She knew something Maher didn't. Silence has power. While he filled the room with noise, she let the pause grow heavier, thicker, more undeniable. Every second, she refused to react, chipping away at his authority, shifting the crowd's focus from his words to her composure, and beyond the walls of the studio, the buzz had already begun. Online clips of the exchange were being posted in real time. Twitter timelines lit up with commentary. Maher pushing too far? Crockett looks ready to end him. TikTok feeds filled with edits, slowed down frames of Jasmine's face. As she leaned forward, waiting, calculating, Reddit threads popped up dissecting every smirk, every pause, every sigh. The internet was holding its collective breath, refreshing again and again, waiting for the inevitable moment they knew was coming. Inside the studio, the tension was electric. Maher chuckled, but the sound landed flat. Clearer it became that he was performing for himself, not for the room. He mistook Jasmine's silence for weakness, for hesitation. He didn't see the strategy, didn't recognize the calculation. He thought he had one before she had even spoken. The audience leaned forward. Phones were lifted, cameras zoomed. The energy shifted subtly, no longer riding the rhythm of Maher's words, but pulled toward Jasmine's silence. People sensed it, that the storm wasn't in his sarcasm, but in her restraint. Every heartbeat, every breath stretched the suspense tighter. Maher's arrogance only deepened. He shrugged, cracked another half-smile, gestured with his hands as if to say, "See?" To add, his voice rose, louder than it needed to be, betraying a flicker of insecurity he couldn't mask. He was trying to hold the room. But the room was already slipping from his grasp, and Jasmine waited. Silent, composed, calculating. The cameras caught the slight tilt of her head, the narrowing of her eyes, the poised stillness of someone who wasn't cornered, but preparing to strike. She didn't need to interrupt. She didn't need to match his volume or his smugness. She knew the power of timing, and her timing was impeccable. The crowd could feel it coming, though they didn't know when. The internet could feel it to every refresh, every clip, every whisper, building anticipation. It wasn't just about a comeback anymore. It was about a reckoning, the moment when dignity would meet arrogance head-on. Maher leaned back once more, confident he had the upper hand. The laughter he had wrung from the crowd was thinner now, more fragile. He grinned. Anyway, oblivious to the shift, blind to the silence growing louder than his words. And then Jasmine moved. She leaned forward, the studio lights catching the determination in her eyes. The laughter stopped. The audience froze. Online feeds began to explode. Then, with one devastating reply, she shattered the room. The silence was thick enough to cut. Maher had just finished his smug quip, leaning back in his chair as if the game was already won. But Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, and the shift in her body language was seismic. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't even smiling. The cameras caught the steel in her eyes, the composure in her jaw. The audience felt it instantly. The moment was about to turn. "Bill," she began, her tone even deliberate, but edged with unmistakable authority, "you call it a joke. But let me explain something. When the punchline always lands on people who look like me, it's not comedy. It's cruelty dressed up with a laugh track." The room went still. Gasps fluttered. Across the audience, a handful of nervous chuckles trailed off into silence. She didn't stop. She pressed forward with precision, each word sharp enough to slice through the air. "You sit here on national television and claim you're for free speech. But let's be real, only protect the voices you agree with. You call others thin-skinned, while hiding behind sarcasm when you're challenged. That's not brave. That's lazy," the crowd murmured, a ripple of shock coursing through them. The studio audience wasn't just watching a talk show exchange. Anymore, they were witnessing something historic. Maher shifted in his seat. His smirk faltered, just slightly, but enough for the cameras to catch. He opened his mouth, as if to interrupt. But Jasmine wasn't giving him an inch. "You've built a career on mocking the powerless while cozying up to the powerful," she continued, her voice unwavering. "When you think calling it political incorrectness makes it clever. But let me tell you, it doesn't make it truth. It makes it cowardice." Gasps. Applause. The tension snapped into eruption. The audience clapped, some even standing, breaking the fragile boundary between show and spectacle. Maher raised his hands, trying to quiet the room. But the noise wasn't his anymore. Jasmine let the applause wash over her, then cut cleanly. "Back in, voice commanding." When you reduce racism to a punchline, you're telling millions of Americans that their pain is your entertainment, that their families, their histories, their dignity are disposable props for your stage. If you think that's edgy, let me assure you it's just old, the crowd roared. The applause was no longer nervous. It was thunderous, cathartic. Maher's face flushed, the smirk gone, replaced with a stiffness he couldn't disguise. He tried to laugh it off, but the laugh came hollow, brittle. His hand twitched toward his cue cards, as if searching for an escape hatch, a pivot line to reclaim control. But Jasmine wasn't done. "See, Bill?" she said, leaning closer, lowering her voice so the silence that followed magnified her words. "You may think this is about me taking offense. But this isn't about me. It's about every single person who's ever been told to laugh off their own humiliation just to keep the peace. It's about who gets to speak without apology and who gets told their truth is too much for prime time." The room erupted again, this time with cheers that drowned out any attempt at recovery. Maher fumbled for a comeback, but nothing landed. His mouth opened, then closed. He blinked, searching for words that refused to come. For the first time in years, the man who always had a line, always had a jab, found himself silenced. The cameras captured it all, the visible crack in his composure, the stunned look that crossed his face as he realized the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't banter anymore. This was reckoning, and online. It was already a wildfire. The exact phrasing, "When the punchline always lands on people who look like me, it's not comedy." Its cruelty was clipped, captioned, replayed. Thousands of times within minutes. Twitter timelines filled with side-by-side GIFs, Maher smirking, then silenced. TikTok edits layered her voice over dramatic music, pausing on the moment his smile faded. Hashtags surged. Hashtag Jasmine silences Maher. Hashtag not just a JOKE. Hashtag truthovercomedy.influencers reposted it with one-liners. She said what needed to be said. This wasn't a clapback, it was history. Even celebrities weighed in, retweeting her words as a rallying cry. It wasn't just a soundbite anymore, it was a cultural moment. Meanwhile, Maher sat in that chair, blinking, adjusting, trying to recalibrate. He muttered something about free debate, but the words sounded defensive, hollow. The audience wasn't with him anymore. They were with her. Jasmine leaned back at last, finally allowing herself a small, satisfied smile, not gloating, not mocking, but the quiet smile of someone who had stood her ground and refused to shrink. The moment belonged to her. Everyone watching knew it. What made it devastating wasn't just the sharpness of her words, but the calm with which she delivered them. She didn't yell. She didn't mirror his sarcasm. She didn't need to. Her composure was the weapon, and truth was the blade. Every beat of her reply had been a hammer striking arrogance until it cracked. Every phrase crafted like a scalpel, cut through years of dismissive humor that had been normalized on stages like his. The reaction was overwhelming. But Jasmine didn't bask in it. She let the silence linger once more after her final words, letting the audience fill it with applause, with cheers, something Maher couldn't manufacture. And in that silence, Maher's empire of provocation trembled. Because it wasn't just that Jasmine had clapped back. It was that she had exposed the limits of his act, that the armor of just joking couldn't withstand truth spoken plainly, calmly, and unapologetically. Across America, the replay was already spreading like electricity. College students sharing it in dorm rooms, families nodding at their dinner tables, communities long tired of being the butt of jokes feeling seen, vindicated, uplifted. The mic drop wasn't just about silencing Maher. It was about amplifying millions of voices who had been laughed at, dismissed, diminished. And as Maher sat there fumbling for words, the irony became too rich to ignore. The man who prided himself on never being at a loss for commentary had been left wordless by a truth he could no longer deflect. The audience erupted one last time, their applause echoing like a gavel striking down. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't need to. She had already won. But the true story wasn't Maher's silence, it was what happened next across America. By the next morning, it wasn't just a debate moment, it was everywhere. Twitter, now X, had transformed into a digital battlefield lit up with hashtags that told the story in real time. Hashtag Crockett Clapback trended alongside hashtag Maher Expose, climbing into the global top 10 within hours. Every timeline was split screen. Jasmine's steady cutting delivery on one side, Bill Maher's stunned silence on the other. Tweets rolled in by the second. She said what we've all been screaming at our screens for years. This wasn't just a clapback, this was a cultural shift. Some users paired her line, "It's not comedy, it's cruelty," with black and white graphics, turning it into a digital slogan that could have belonged on a protest sign. Others clipped Maher's fumbling reaction and looped it into GIFs, captioned with ruthless punchlines, "When the joke finally turns on you." But Twitter was just the beginning. On TikTok, the moment became a movement. Edits layered Jasmine's words over swelling background music, punctuated with freeze frames on Maher's cracking smirk. The silence after her delivery became a viral audio trend, with creators lip-syncing her line. It's not comedy, it's cruelty, applying it to their own lives' racist schoolyard jokes. Sexist office banter, dismissive family conversations. Suddenly, her words weren't just about Maher. They were about everyone who'd ever been told to laugh off their pain. Memes exploded too. Screenshots of Maher's face were plastered with captions like, "The silence is deafening," and "When your sarcasm finally meets substance." Even late-night comedy, usually Maher's playground, turned on him. Hosts delivered monologues flipping the script. Usually Bill is the one doing the takedowns this week. He got taken down. The laughter wasn't with him anymore. It was at him. And then came the commentators. Influencers, political analysts, and cultural critics rushed to weigh in. Some defenders of Maher clung to the familiar script. "He's just a comedian. Lighten up." But those voices were drowned out by the overwhelming tide of praise for Jasmine. Progressive commentators hailed it as the moment satire was reclaimed from smug provocation and handed back to truth-tellers. Activists called it a masterclass in dignity, responding not with anger or insults, but with unwavering clarity. Politicians joined the chorus. One congresswoman tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett spoke for millions who've been the punchline for too long. That's not a clapback, that's leadership." The senator referenced her words in a floor speech about media accountability, while grassroots organizations turned the viral clip into a rallying cry at local events. For everyday people, the ripple effect was even more visceral. Families shared the video at dinner tables, nodding with pride. Teachers played it in classrooms to spark discussions on comedy, culture, and responsibility. Community leaders quoted Jasmine in town halls and sermons. Her response had leaped from a studio stage into the bloodstream of the nation. What made it unstoppable was its duality. It was both entertaining and profound. The memes made it funny. The commentary made it serious. The edits made it dramatic. And Jasmine's delivery made it unforgettable. She had turned Maher's stage into her stage, and now the entire country was sitting in the audience. Even Maher himself couldn't ignore the storm. His team released a statement the following day, framing the exchange as healthy debate and defending his intent as humor misinterpreted. But the damage was done. Screenshots of his press release were dunked on relentlessly, with one viral reply reading, "Translation, I got cooked on my own show." The power of the moment wasn't just that Jasmine had shut down a comedian. It was that she'd reframed the terms of the conversation. For years, critics of offensive humor had been dismissed as oversensitive. Her words, "It's not comedy, it's cruelty," shifted the narrative. They resonated across identities, generations, and political divides. They gave language to something people had felt but hadn't been able to articulate. And as the clip reached millions, something deeper was happening. Beneath the memes, beneath the hashtags, beneath the laughter and outrage, a new question was rising. If a single moment of truth could silence the loudest voices of dismissal, what else could it awaken? Because this wasn't just a viral clapback. This was the beginning of a cultural reckoning. And that reckoning was only just beginning. Beneath the memes and the noise, something deeper was shifting. In the days that followed, as the hashtags cooled and the clips became familiar, Jasmine Crockett herself brought the conversation back to its core. She didn't bask in the memes or the applause. Instead, she reframed the clash with a clarity that cut through the noise. This was never about a comedian telling a joke. It was about the line between mockery and respect, between arrogance and dignity, between cruelty and truth, she reminded the public that comedy has power, immense power. But power without responsibility is just another form of domination. For decades, those in positions like Maher's had hidden behind the shield of, "It's just a joke." Dismissing the lived pain of communities who'd been the punchline for too long, Jasmine's response exposed that shield for what it really was, a mask for prejudice dressed up as wit. And once the mask was gone, the audience could see clearly. Her words were simple, but their impact was seismic. Authenticity, she showed, beats arrogance. Courage outshines mockery. When you choose to stand firm in truth, you don't need a stage. A microphone, or even a laugh track you carried the authority of lived experience. And that's enough to silence even the loudest voices. And that was why her stand resonated far beyond one studio stage. It echoed in homes, classrooms, and community centers across America because it tapped into something universal. Everyone has felt the sting of being dismissed, belittled, or told to take a joke when the joke cut too deep. Jasmine had turned that private wound into a public truth, and in doing so, she validated millions. She spoke for those who had been waiting for someone to say what they'd always known in their bones. Dignity is not optional. Respect is not a punchline. Humanity cannot be reduced to a laugh. The beauty of her moment was not in humiliating Maher. It wasn't about flipping the script for the sake of applause. It was about showing that there is a different way forward, one where humor doesn't have to rely on harm, where power can be challenged without cruelty, and where authenticity is stronger than any smirk or sarcastic jab. For progressives, immigrants, for anyone who has ever carried the weight of history in a room that wanted to laugh them off. Jasmine's voice became more than a clapback. It became a beacon. It reminded people that standing up doesn't always mean shouting louder. Sometimes it means standing taller, holding steady, and letting truth carry its own thunder. And that's why this wasn't just a late-night moment gone viral. It was a cultural turning point. It showed that the old playbook, mock, dismiss, laugh, repeat, was breaking down. In its place, a new narrative was rising, one rooted in empathy, accountability, and the simple but radical idea that every person deserves respect. The lesson was plain, but profound. You can joke about power, but you cannot joke away someone's dignity. Jasmine had crystallized that truth in a single exchange, and it landed like a lightning bolt, and for millions watching. The choice was suddenly clear: laughter at someone's expense or dignity for all. Maher mocked, Jasmine answered. What began as just another late-night joke spiraled into something far bigger. A moment when truth cut through arrogance, when dignity silenced mockery, and when millions of people saw themselves reflected in Jasmine's strength. It wasn't only about one clash on one stage. It was about the timeless battle between those who belittle and those who rise. If you felt that power, if you felt your chest tighten when the audience laughed, and then ease when Jasmine answered, you're not alone. That reaction wasn't just entertainment. It was validation. It was the reminder that voices like hers, voices like yours, matter. They don't just push back against noise, they rewrite the narrative. And that's exactly what this community is about. Not just watching drama unfold, but standing together in the belief that authenticity beats arrogance, that respect is non-negotiable, and that truth always finds its way. So if you believe dignity deserves the last word, if you want to be part of a space that lifts up courage over cruelty and justice over cheap laughs, then don't just watch. Join, subscribe, share this story. Add your voice to a growing community that knows the fight isn't over, but refuses to be silent. Because in the end, the lesson is clear. Arrogance fades, mockery stumbles, but truth endures. And every time someone like Jasmine stands tall, it echoes louder than the punchlines ever could. This is your moment too. Stand with us, be heard. Choose dignity over arrogance, truth over noise, and help carry this story forward.